Good evening, everyone. I hope you're settled and looking forward to a great discussion this evening. I'm Rosamund Bennett, the CEO of Christian Aid Ireland, and you're very welcome to tonight's event facilitated by Trócaire and Christian Aid. Both organisations have been working in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories for some years now. In terms of Christian Aid, we've been working there since the 1950s. And we work through partners there, and tonight we're joined by two partners, B'Tselem and Al-Haq, and they're very highly respected organisations in the region, and it's a privilege to be able to hear directly from Hagai and Shawan tonight. Now, I'd planned to travel back to IOPT last year, but COVID put an end to those plans. So this is a really wonderful opportunity for us all to hear directly from very knowledgeable and respected sources about what's happening in Israel and Palestine and the challenges that our partners are facing in doing their work. And I'm sure with COVID dominating the headlines over the past year that a lot of the events, a lot of things happening in the region probably haven't received the media attention they deserve. So I'm really looking forward, as I hope you are too, to hearing from our panelists tonight. Let me introduce them. We have Hagai El-Ad. He is the Executive Director of B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. Previously, he was Director of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel and the Jerusalem Open House for Pride and Tolerance. And in 2014, El-Ad was among Foreign Policy's 100 leading global thinkers. And in 2016 and again in 2018, he spoke before the United Nations Security Council, calling for international action in order to end the occupation. And he lives in Jerusalem. And if you want to follow him on Twitter, he tweets at Hagai El-Ad. And then we come on to Shawan. Shannon Jabarin is General Director of Al-Haq, which is an independent Palestinian human rights organization. Established in 1979 to protect and promote human rights and the rule of law in the occupied Palestinian territory. And the organization has special consultative status with United Nations Economic and Social Council and documents violations of the individual and collective rights of Palestinians in the OPT, irrespective of the identity of the perpetrator. And Shawan is also Secretary General of the International Federation for Human Rights, a member of the Middle East Advisory Board of Human Rights Watch, and was Amnesty International's first Palestinian prisoner of conscience. And B'Tselem and Al-Haq are joint recipients of the 1989 Carter Minnell Human Rights Award, the 2009 Geusen-Penning Prize for Human Rights Defenders, the 2011 PL Foundation Human Rights Award, and the 28th Human Rights Prize of the French Republic. So Trócaire and Christian Aid are very pleased to have both such prestigious organisations, not just as our partners, but speaking here and speaking directly to us tonight. And finally, we have Shona Murray, who is the Europe correspondent with Euronews. I'm sure a lot of people know her. Shona was previously political correspondent with the Irish Independent and foreign affairs correspondent with News Talk. And she's currently specialising in Brexit. Sorry, Shona, sorry for your troubles there. She has reported from dozens of countries with a particular focus on Israel and Gaza, the wider Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And she's also reported from Iraq, Turkey, Syria border, Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Haiti, and Guantanamo Bay. And I know she's visited a number of those countries with both Trócaire and Christian Aid. So I'll just hand over to you now, Shona, to get this evening started.
Thanks a million, Rosamund, and thanks for everyone for joining us. There's around 400 people tonight, and so please do send in your comments and any questions that you might have in the Q&A button. But want to get started as soon as we possibly can because there's so much to get through. And one of the first things I want to start off with is this week's elections, of course, in Israel. Hagai, I might just go to you on that because you're there in Jerusalem. Fourth election in 2 years. It looks like another quagmire for Netanyahu. Tell us how you assess it.
Thank you. Maybe just before answering the question, I want to thank our Irish hosts for this evening's event and for their support, and also to say how honored I am to be speaking this evening alongside my esteemed and very beloved and appreciated colleague Shawan. So thank you, and I very much look forward to this evening's event. I think that on the elections, very early to make direct conclusions on the political sphere, but I think in the broader context of things, there's a number of points that are very clear and are not obscure at all, and are worth pointing out. One, it's the fourth time in 2 years in which those that do have political rights, citizens, vote not only on their own future, but also on the future of millions of Palestinian subjects that are not participating in repeated elections in Israel. And this is not just a phenomena of the last 2 years. For most of the time that Israel has existed, and for the majority of election cycles in this country, this has been the reality. It's been completely normalized. Then when citizens get to vote, we vote not only on our future, but also on the future of Palestinians who are not even being asked, and sometimes are casted as political football for the benefit of various political parties that are competing with each other, trying to get more voters by pointing out how much worse they're going to make it for Palestinians. The other point, which is not obscure at all, is that beyond the internal controversy surrounding Netanyahu's personal corruption, there's actually a very broad, solid majority in parliament that supports one variation or another of the continuation of the current situation. That shouldn't be missed with all of the arguments about the personal future of the current prime minister. There's actually 70, 80 plus members of parliament. That's out of a parliament of 120, so well above half, that are in absolute agreement that the current reality, they're totally fine with perpetual subjugation of Palestinians and continuation with one variation or another of the current reality. And I think that if all this is not enough, then the most recent development is also the success of the Jewish Power faction as part of the religious Zionism party to move into parliament for the first time, an ultra-nationalist racist party that has been brokered by the personal intervention of the prime minister so that they will be able to form that political party to be successful in the elections. So this is not distant from the prime minister. This is like intimately associated with his political project, but also to say that, and we're talking about the most extreme settlers from Hebron and so on, but also to realize that the success of the settlement project in Hebron, for instance, as all of it, is not just a result of some quote unquote bad settlers that have hijacked the policies of the state, but these are the policies of the state, and this is backed by the government, by the courts, by the army.
Well, that is a really depressing picture, Hagai. I mean, in the run-up to the election, I suppose, during the hustings and so on, were there any parties who actually sought to use the Palestinian-Israeli peace process as as a way of gaining power in a positive way, saying, actually, let's have a two-state solution, let's give self-determination, or at least a better life for Palestinians? Or is it that you're actually more likely to get votes if you're more hardline against the Palestinians?
Most of the discussion is amongst hardliners. If one needs a visual image of that, is a scene that unfolded a couple of days before Election Day, in which Israeli politicians were being interviewed from a broad variety of parties with the backdrop of the Palestinian community of Khan al-Ahmar. Just behind them, a community which is slated to be forcibly transferred, to be demolished, and for the people to be removed from their land. That backdrop, and that's a war crime, plain and simple. And to have that backdrop, and again, people that have no political rights, that the political parties are bidding for more votes because they're making promises that they will be more assertive, more aggressive, more criminal in pushing those people out. That's where we are. And the discussion of the issue of the future of the rights of millions of Palestinians living under Israeli control, that has almost completely become absent from the political discourse in Israel, people are voting on other issues. People are voting on the health crisis, the economy, housing, probably transportation, those issues. And that's really a question. I hope we'll come back to that later in this conversation. How do we change that situation? And also just throw it out there, I'm not sure it's related that much to the question of what's known as the two-state solution. I think we need to think about the reality here in a different way.
Just before I move on to Shawan, I just want to ask you, because I think it's important, how have things deteriorated? You mean, I mentioned there some of the settlers, some of the most extreme settlers in Hebron are now possibly being brought into the sort of mainstream, quote unquote, political fold. Was that was something unquestionable maybe 10 years ago, and now it's evolved into that way? Is that really the direction we're going? Did anybody at any point say, well, look, this is actually wrong. These are war crimes we're talking about. These are, our Palestinian neighbors.
Yeah, I have an issue with the way sometimes it's thought that the settlements is some sort of like the project of like extreme individuals in Jewish society in Israel. We should be reminded that the Jewish settlement in Hebron was established after the 1967 war under a labor government, right? Not Netanyahu, not Likud, not Trump, right? And that the settlement project is a project that has been supported and advanced by Israeli governments, left, right, and center since 1967. And again, initiated in the beginning by a labor government. The discussions more recently, for instance, about formal annexation of the Jordan Valley, for instance, when that was thrown out by Likud, then you could have people from labor jumping and saying, hey, that was originally our idea, right? And it was originally their idea since the early 1970s under the Alon plan, right? Under labor, like not extreme or not perceived as extreme. So this is a project that is central to Israeli policies and also obviously related to the situation inside the Green Line. And again, I hope we'll get to that later. So it's not about bad settlers. It's about the policies of the state of Israel.
Thanks, Vinit. Shawan, from what we heard there from Hagai, how worried are you now as a Palestinian, that really it's much more important for Israeli politicians to brag or to ensure that the settlement situation continues and from a Palestinian point of view exacerbates?
Look, let me first of all thank you all organizers, our partners, and also the participants. It's a great honor to be with you tonight. And when I speak to the Irish colleagues, I go back, to 2004-05 when I was in Galway. I got my LLM from Galway, and I'm familiar, with the situation there, and to speak to the friends and colleagues also there. Look, I would like just to add a few points to what Hagai said. When I speak together with Hagai, to the audience, he makes my life very easy because I completely agree, with his analysis, his points. But I would like to add two things. One is I think the mainstream policy that Israel has is, and long-term policy is targeting the existence of Palestinians because they are targeting, the land of Palestinians. This is, I think, it doesn't need from me, to bring more proofs of that. This is on a daily basis. This is also in the statements. This is on the official policies. And they use different means and different methods, to get to that point. This is because of that, I think the issue of two-state solution, it's not on the agenda of any Israeli government. That's the case. On the agenda is how to take more land, how to push Palestinians outside of the country, how to reduce their existence and their numbers also in Palestine. That's, the strategy that they have. Because of that, when we speak about two-state solution, I do believe about it, but it can come if there is an actions taking Another point I would like to highlight is Netanyahu and the Likud. This is the fourth time of elections, and he get more and more of voters and also seats. Why he doesn't get that? You know, I think he's speaking openly to his people. He said, "Hey guys, I do everything that you want. I take more land. I expand more settlements. I kill more Palestinians. I make their life, let me say, hard and impossible. And in the same time, nothing happened against us. And you have no fear. You have no fear, guys. Go and continue. And I'm doing now peace, you know, with Bahrain and with the others. That's because of that, the people, they vote for it. Just imagine if there is one action taken by the international community or by any state, for instance, not to let the settlers leaders, for instance, to get in, to have like Schengen visa, to go freely to Europe, and to put some of them in just blacklist. Here, I think the question why will come again to Israeli audience, to Israeli public, to others, to politicians, academics, and everyone. They say, why it's happened against us like this? Oh, because of the occupation. Why it's happened? Because we commit, you know, war crimes. Without actions, nothing will change. That's, you know, the main point. Another thing is, now they have, you know, the 4 rounds of elections in Israel, but we haven't that. And the problem is not the occupation. Because of that, you know, we haven't it. This is, you know, the internal issue of Palestinians, but part of that is the Israelis. Just you can imagine now, the President Abbas decided that we will have a free election in Palestine, including Gaza, and there is no free movement between Gaza and West Bank. How you can carry out your election campaign, for instance, as a candidates? How you can speak to your audience and to your public and to the people, for instance? Another thing is, the Israeli intelligence officers, they ordered, you know, Palestinian politicians, mainly from Hamas, and they speak to them openly in this way. If you run the election, if you support, if even you try to think about the election, we will bring you back to the prison, you know, to put you under administrative detention. Administrative detention is an arbitrary detention. This is the way how they are dealing and treating Palestinians. Even they don't want us. They don't want to let us even practice democracy internally. They don't want us, for instance, to join the international conventions, treaties relating to the human rights. Why they don't want us, for instance, to join, let me say, CEDAW, to protect women in Palestine? Because they are targeting our identity. They don't want to hear that we are a people, that we have fundamental rights. Just we are a few here or there. It's like servants, you know. This is how they are dealing with that. This is not, I'm not exaggerating when I say this. No, this is the reality also in the ground, when it comes, for instance, to the annexation, when it comes, you know, the practices, when it comes to laws, when it comes to everything from A to Z. Just you can imagine that they don't let a woman, for instance, a mom, to join her baby who has cancer. And in Jerusalem hospital, Augusta Victoria, for instance, because this is the only one can provide, let me say, chemical treatment. And they don't let her because there is security reasons. They don't let, for instance, a mom with 80 years old to go, for instance, to visit her son in the Israeli prisons, for instance, for security reasons. Wow, what's this? What's this? To this extent, that's, I think, the situation in Palestine. That's the situation under the occupation. This is what it means. They don't let Palestinians from Jerusalem to take a box of eggs from Ramallah to Jerusalem, but in the same time, they let the settlers to take, you know, boxes of eggs, you know, from the settlements to go to Israel, to Tel Aviv, everywhere. They don't stop them. This is the situation under the occupation. What it means, this.
Well, look, Shawan, both of you have described really a depressing road that Israel seems to be going down. Discrimination, more discrimination, more settlements, more separation, without even the pretense of wanting to have, I suppose, a partnership or self-determination for Palestinians. You know, I might just talk to B'Tselem's position on this, which is that this according to B'Tselem, is an apartheid regime. And obviously that is a huge assessment to make. It has incredible ramifications for the Israeli state, for international law, for international humanitarian law. So Hagai, just talk us through, in detail, I suppose, why you believe you can now come to that position.
Yes. So yeah, it's been a sea change moment for us, and I'm sure everyone can appreciate after more than 3 decades of work. B'Tselem was founded back in 1989 during the first Intifada, and since then we have exclusively only worked on human rights violations in the occupied Palestinian territories in East Jerusalem, the rest of the West Bank, and in the Gaza Strip. That has been our exclusive mandate throughout the period of 30 years plus. And one could have seen that throughout those years, both the thinking and the analysis in the organization has changed, right? We, in the beginning, thought we were addressing an occupation, and then we moved on to talking about a prolonged occupation. More recently, we've begun describing the situation as a one-state reality, but we came to the conclusion after a long and thorough internal process that this is just not sufficient. And that if we want to make a fair assessment, an accurate assessment of what is it, this injustice that we're fighting against, then we need to make an assessment that takes into account the entire area that the government controls, right? There's one government between the river and the sea, the government of the State of Israel, that controls everyone and everything in various ways, all 14 million people that live in this area. And that's a departure from a worldview that continues to analyze the situation in a way that we think has become completely untethered to reality, which says that it's a permanent democracy on one side of the green line. Maybe it's a flawed democracy, maybe there's some issues, but a democracy yet. And there's a temporary occupation on the other side of the green line. So a model that looks at this reality and says democracy plus occupation. And sometimes bundled with that is this 2 minutes to midnight aspect of it, which includes endless warnings. So it says on the one hand, this is democracy plus occupation, and if something will happen, then it might become something else. But that's always framed in the future. If formal annexation will take place, then it will be something else. If another settlement is built in a strategic location, then everything is going to change. And those warnings have been issued for 5 years, for 10 years, for 15 years. And yet the clock seems to be stuck from the perspective of those that have been making these warnings, stuck for more than a decade on 2 minutes to midnight. So we think no, it's not stuck on 2 minutes to midnight. And we need to wake up to the reality that has already become the factual, correct way of describing the situation. Why? Because when you keep saying democracy plus occupation, you're ignoring 600,000 Jewish settlers that live in permanent communities in the occupied territories. You're ignoring the fact that part of the territory has been formally annexed, East Jerusalem, and that the rest of the territory has been de facto annexed. You're ignoring the fact that the actions taken by the Israeli army in the occupied territories are not somehow contradictory or independent from the Israeli government, but actually just serve the same policies that the government, the civilian government in Jerusalem is deciding on. But if all this is not enough, not waking up to it being a single regime also ignores the fact that there's the same organizing principle that is in effect on both sides of the green line. The principle of advancing the interests of Jews in order to advance and solidify Jewish supremacy, Jewish domination over Palestinians. And that's not just happening on the other side of the green line, that's also happening inside the green line. It's the same principle on both sides of the green line. Now, obviously, there are differences in the levels of subjugation and discrimination and denial of rights between different Palestinians that live in the different areas that Israel's control. It's not the same if you're a Palestinian citizen inside Israel proper, or if you're a permanent resident in formerly annexed East Jerusalem, or if you're a Palestinian subject like Shawan, living in the occupied West Bank, or if you're one of more than 2 million Palestinians that are locked up in what has become one of the largest open-air prisons on the planet in the Gaza Strip. There are differences, but those, and we go in great detail and in nuance and accuracy in exploring these differences in the short position paper that we published that explores in some greater detail what I'm summarizing right now. But those differences shouldn't obscure from us the headline and the underlying reality, which is that nowhere between the river and the sea, nowhere in the area Israel controls, a Jewish person and a Palestinian person are equal. That's the key aspect of this reality. And then in the position paper, we explore the way this is implemented in 4 key areas in terms of the geographic re-engineering of space, what happens to land under this regime, and for who it is allocated, and for whose benefit, and from who it is taken from. That's one pillar. The other one is a demographic re-engineering of space, who can come here, and here not just to Israel proper again, into the entire area. Once again, I'm emphasizing that. Political rights, who has them and who does not, and freedom of movement. We analyze these four aspects. That's apartheid, a regime that is working to advance and guarantee the supremacy of one group over another. That's apartheid, and that's the reality that we live in.
Hagai, could you, for people who are watching now who haven't been to the Palestinian territories or may have been there 10, 15 years ago, but things have changed, could you give us a description, I suppose, for what you mean in terms of how different people are treated, let's say different roads that they may travel on? You mentioned there, obviously, the different characteristics of people living in certain areas, Palestinian subject, you could be a Palestinian but have an Israeli passport. Just talk a little bit about the day-to-day and how that is distinguished from, let's say, an Israeli Jewish person.
Yeah, so first, if I take you on a tour of the occupied West Bank, then what people will see is the process of the permanent Bantustanization of that area. Israel is closing in around the Palestinian population centers, often known as Area A, Area B, and they're surrounded, and they're getting more and more surrounded. And there's an array of techniques that Israel is using in order to accomplish that. The separation barrier, military checkpoints, roads that Israel builds, and other pieces of infrastructure, settlements, military training zones, state land. And all of these things add up so that the empty air, the relatively less populated areas are used for the benefit of Israeli interests, building settlements, and the Palestinians are gradually seeing the world closing up around them. In the Ramallah Bantustan, in the Jenin Bantustan, and in and then the other Bantustan, which is separated from all of the others, which is the Gaza one, right? But in that sense, we can actually talk about the process of creating more and more islands of like Gaza surrounded by Israeli control in the Bantustans of the West Bank. Now that means that on the one hand, Israel gets away with pretending, and that's like one of the fondest propaganda lines of my government, that Palestinians live an independent life free from Israeli control because the majority of the Palestinian population lives in the cities controlled by the PA and so on. That cannot be furthest from the truth, right? Not only because all of the surrounding area is controlled by Israel, so you have these Palestinian islands that are drowning in an ocean of Israeli control, but also obviously because the Israeli army goes into Ramallah whenever it wants to go into Ramallah or into any other Palestinian area. So it's not just about the areas around. And also you can understand that there's inability to develop infrastructure agriculture connectivity between various communities, because every space between the Bantustans is controlled by Israel. And with that, I'll finish. I haven't said anything about what happens to Palestinians that live in Area C, in the areas that Israel wants to push them out from.
Shawan, obviously you would concur with all that, and you illustrated yourself in your own example when you talked about how women can't even, visit their children in hospitals because they can't access it. I know that's been going on for so long now with checkpoints and so on. With this sort of assessment of apartheid, how do you think that may or may not impact, I suppose, the global pressure on Israel, or will it? Do you have any hope there? I think you're on mute, Shawan, are you? Can you?
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, thank
you. Before I come to that point, I would like to add two things. One, when we studied this occupation, it's not an ordinary occupation. And we studied deeply, and in depth. And we found that this is an occupation with the nature of colonialism and apartheid in practices, in policies, and in everything. Just you can imagine, we are not poor people. If we have a sovereignty over our natural resources, we can gain $10 billion a year from our natural resources: land, water, minerals, tourism, and everything. Israel, they are pillaging all of these natural resources for their interest and for their use. Because of that, they transfer water, just to provide people in Tel Aviv or in the settlements or elsewhere. And we are, as Palestinians, we have no running water 24 hours to drink. We have no water to drink during summer. That's the case. But in the same time, the settlers, they have swimming pools, and they have 24 hours running water. If you come to Ramallah or if you come to Palestine, you will see, plastic tanks, containers over their houses. This is Palestinian houses. Settlers, they haven't that. Why? Because this is just to keep water, to save water for a week, 6 days, sometimes, twice a week, the water that Ramallah can get. And here you can imagine. People, for instance, living in Jordan Valley, they bring, like Bedouins, they bring, water. They use machines to bring waters there. And some of these equipments, it's funded also by the Irish people. And the Israelis, they came to them and they confiscate these equipments, not to let them drink water. This is the case. Why? To push them outside of the area. This is what's going on a daily basis. It's not just an issue, it's happened sometimes, occasionally. No, if you take any of our publications that we published in 80s, you just make an update for that publication today, which it means that this is part of the continuous policy. This is widespread practice. It's not just an isolated incident. No, this is part of a policy. That's one of the main thing. Here, this brings me that all of us, we know what's going on. The international community, they know because they have also their diplomatic missions here, and they write reports. I'm sure that they write good reports just to describe what's going on, and they send it to capitals. At the international level, they know what's going on, and just they condemn that sometimes, condemnation, and that's it. They have been doing this since so long. And we see that the occupation is deepening, that the frustration is deepening of the Palestinian people. We see that the oppression is continuing and nothing changed. No, it's worse. It's all, going from worse to worse. That's the case. And here the question is, what's lack in that? I think what's lack in that is the actions by, international community. And we are not asking for ethical, support. We are asking, to implement their legal obligation, to respect their legal obligation under the international law. That's the only thing. As individual states, for instance, or as a collective states. One of that also, Ireland, you can take actions And this is also part of the obligation, legal obligation. You have to act, you have to raise. You have, for instance, to sanction. Sanction is one of that. Europe, for instance, sanctions Russia because of Crimea. In 1 week, they did that. Why Palestine is an exceptional case? They don't want to touch because of Israel. Okay, if Israel doing good things, it's okay, let's go. You yourself said that this is war crimes. This is crimes against humanity. Why you don't intervene in that? Why you intervened in other places over the world, for instance? That's, I think, what's missing in all of this. This is the code. This is the main code, you know, that if we want to change the situation and to deal with the people as a Palestinian as a people, and they have fundamental rights of self-determination, for instance, and two-state solution, you can recognize, for instance, the Palestinian state. For instance, this is a symbolic thing. We know that this is a symbolic thing. Why you don't recognize it? Second, for instance, why you have to open your market, for instance, to the Israeli settlements products to your market? Why you have to let that come to your market? This is an issue. You have to ban the products of the settlements, and you have to do this. This is part of your obligation. I'm not speaking here, you know, emotionally, ethically. No. This is part of your legal obligation. If you recognize a settlement as a war crime, for instance, and also this is the main difficulty before a peace, and this is, you know, the issue that making an oppression against Palestinians. The Israeli troops, they are there. It's not just to protect the security, to protect the security of settlements, to make, you know, the settlers expanding their settlements, and to help them in that, to provide them everything like that, and to let them, for instance, attack Palestinians. This is the case. I think it's a time, you know, for actions. Or if you don't want to let that happen, for instance, there is a question. Do you think that the Palestinian will stay like this forever? The protection, the rights is fundamental and essential in any conflict. If you don't protect the people, they will start thinking about their own ways to protect themselves. That's the case. If you don't want to let international law, for instance, to enforce and to be implemented and to be respected, for instance, it means that you will let also the rule of jungle, if you don't want to let rule of law to happen.
Shawan, have you had, Shawan, I know that you have a relationship with the Irish government, Al-Haq does anyway, for sure. I mean, if you had conversations around maybe the recognition of Palestine as a state, particularly now that Ireland is as a temporary seat in the Security Council, do you think that would make much of a difference if the Irish government were to do that? Just keep the answer brief, because I want to move on to a few other topics.
Look, these days, one of the main things, it's a threat, really, it's real threats on our society and everywhere. It's the hope on people's minds. People, they lost their hope with the international law, with the peaceful ways, with the international community, all of these things. By recognizing this, I think, even by individual states, this will maintain hope in people's minds. They will start feel that, yeah, there are people, for instance, thinking, there are states thinking with them, for them, and they are ready to take actions, even if it's a symbolic one. Another thing, it will send to the Israelis also a message saying that we will not stay like this forever. We have to take something. And by maintaining also the relation with this state, let me say trade relations with Palestine, for instance, and push Israel and put conditions on the Israeli relations with Ireland or with other country, this is a very important thing. There is a menu, there is a list, you know, of actions that they can take. And this is according law. It's not just political things. No, it's not political steps. This is also a legal steps. If you do believe about Palestinians' rights of self-determination, for instance, you have to translate that to actions and policies.
Okay, that's grand. So I want to get to...
Jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just jump in
because I want to get to people's questions as well. So go ahead.
Just very quickly, connecting what Shawan said now to the elections the other day, there's a reason why this is a non-issue in his domestic politics. There's a reason why people And public opinion polls, so this is not my assessment of the situation. This is what public opinion polls in Israel demonstrate. There's a reason why people, when they vote on all of these other issues and not on the issue of freedom and justice for Palestinians. And the reason for that is that there is no crisis in Israel's international standing, international relations with anyone. And in that sense, it's a repeated international intervention that is basically backing the current reality, that is backing apartheid, because every day there is no crisis, it spells out to the average voter that the world is accepting the permanent subjugation and apartheid by Israel against Palestinians.
Okay, for question in from Lucy Donegan, do you have any faith in the hope that the ICC's investigation into alleged war crimes in East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank? Do either of you have any hope that that will deliver some international justice? Shawan, I'll just go to you and keep it brief if you can, because I want to get into a few questions. Thanks. You're on mute there.
The Israelis, they try to destroy the international justice system. I think everybody has not to let Israel success in this, and they have to maintain, the justice for victims and for rule of law. This is an important, and this is the cornerstone, in any peace in the future. Without justice, no peace and no security. We have to keep that in our mind. And if you don't want, to let victims seeking for justice and to hold the criminals accountable for their crimes and to end the culture of impunity, no way for any rule of law and for any, peace in the future or now. That's the case. And here I think it's essential also for peace to hold the criminals accountable. This is a prevention. This is a prevention also matter. It's not just a stick, in your hands just to beaten those criminals. No, this is also for the future, for the criminals to account until 10 before they commit their crimes. Because
Shawan,
of the
can I ask you, Shawan, sorry, do you have faith that the ICC will deliver international justice? Are you?
I have no doubt of that. Okay. The Israelis now, the Americans and the others, support Israel's trying to damage the system. But I think the system now, mainly after, the issuing their decision to open the investigation, okay. I think they show that they are independent, professional, and they are defending even the image and the independence of the court.
Well, that's one bit of hope then. Kieran, a question in here from Kieran Tierney. You hit on it earlier, Hagai. It's clear that maybe a two-state solution is dead, but is a one-state solution with equal rights for all a possibility? But I think you'll probably say not, but I don't want to speak for you, Hagai.
Yeah, we're a human rights organization. We're not connected to any specific political outcome. What I do want to say is that we think that's part of the problem, that it has become an obsession with answering what is the correct number of states within the river and the sea, as if that's the only thing that matters, and disregarding what the actual substance, the delivery of rights for the people that will live under that reality will be. So for instance, two dictatorships living side by side in peace and security, I don't want to live in either one of them, right? What we need to focus on is not on future negotiations, because that has been used by Israel for the past 20 years to triple the number of settlers with impunity. What we need to focus on is the current reality. We need to focus on this reality of apartheid and address it now.
Okay. Shawan, I want to ask you about something there, because you're in the West Bank, and we talked about the Palestinian Authority earlier with Hagai. The Israeli position is that it's not giving vaccines to Palestinians because it's the Palestinian Authority's responsibility. Can you update us on the situation there with access to vaccines for Palestinians? Because I think people would like to know, seeing as everybody needs one.
Look, before I came to here, I just shared my condolences with friends and families, and the closer friends with me. Every day we have died, people, the average is 25 to 30, 35 persons, on a daily basis. And there is no vaccine. Okay, they received some vaccines, but it's not enough, for people. And in the Israelis, at the same time, the Israeli government, they offer their vaccines to African countries, to the dictators here and there, for instance, and to make a deal with them, to vote for them just to protect their crimes, at the UN level and other levels, but they don't act according to their legal obligation. This is a ridiculous things that we have state or something like that. The Palestinian Authority, it's like, I don't want to exaggerate in that. I can say it's like what's subcontractor things. That's the case. According law, if I want to follow law and international humanitarian law, Israel, they have an obligation, to protect and to provide vaccines to the people under the occupation, the protected persons. We are the protected persons. That's the case, but they ignore that. And they use, I think, the Palestinian Authority as a way to escape from their legal obligation and making like ridiculous messages here and there. If Palestinians, they have to enjoy their sovereignty and they have to enjoy their authority well, when it comes to the population, to land, and to everything. Just they stopped, Palestinian foreign minister a few days ago because he came back from The Hague and just to cooperate with the ICC. And they confiscated and revoked his VIP, and also they questioned the other two ambassadors, Ammar and Omar. They questioned them why they cooperate with the ICC. This is the case. This is the Palestinian Authority, how they live. Even our president, if he wants to leave the country, he has to ask for the Israeli permit to leave. If he wants to go to visit another city, he has to ask the Israeli military authority permit to go from here or there. This is the president, and this is the case.
And just on the vaccines issue, did you get some vaccines from Israel, or they all come from COVAX? Mainly
COVAX, yeah, it came from COVAX, and some of them that the Palestinians, they bought it, from other
from Russia.
Companies.
Okay. Hagai, a message here from Alicia. Can change come from within Israel, or are Israelis lacking an understanding of what's happening in the occupied Palestinian territories?
Change eventually will come by Israelis and Palestinians, but it's not just going to come independently out of its own accord, because people will suddenly feel bad about what we're doing to Palestinians. That's just not the way it's going to happen. Morality alone is not going to win the day. What is needed is to give Jewish citizens a self-interest reason to reconsider their political choices. And the way to do that is by international action. And again, as I was saying before, and Shawan made that point very powerfully before, and I totally agree with him, without international intervention, we're telling people here that change is not required, because the world not only tolerates it, the world supports it, right? If that changes, if consequences are introduced, if impunity is ended, if action is taken, not more statements, but action is taken, then we have a fighting chance, because people will have a self-interest reason to reconsider their choices.
Shawan, you've been working in human rights for so long in the Palestinian territories, for Palestinians, for Gazans, and so on. I mean, how are you feeling now that things have actually deteriorated? How are you feeling emotionally? Or do you have any hope that politically, as Hagai said, that change can come from within? And I suppose the other point you're making, that, countries like Ireland, they condemn actions by the Israelis, but they don't meet that with any sort of action.
Look, Sean, to be honest with you, I face this question most of the time. I speak to you very openly as a person in this field since so long, and I see that situation is deteriorating, but I still have a hope. And I do believe with 2 or 3 things. One, we will not disappear as Palestinians. And we are not concerned from a long-term future. And if there is one has to be concerned, not the Palestinians, from long-term future. Third one, I do believe about justice, and the future is for justice. Nothing will stay as it is forever. And the powerful, it's not the issue you build your future on it. This is a changeable thing in history. And we have lessons in history. We read history well, and we do believe about it, to be honest with you. We will not disappear. We will continue fighting for justice. And if it's not happened in my lifetime, it will happen in my children's time. That's the issue. And this is really the faith that I have. Because of that, I continue struggle against the oppression, the oppressive regime, and struggle for justice and the human rights. I have no doubt of that. But the question is why we have to pay this high price until we reach that moment. And when I ask the international community to intervene, I ask them and say, could you please help to shorten the time of the painful? Could you please help to shorten the time of suffering? This is, what I do believe and what I call and what I ask. But I do believe that we are strong people and we have young generation. They are smart and good and enough. Even if the Israelis, they want to, to fragment the Palestinian. This is the main strategy that they have, fragmenting Palestinian society. And they are not dealing with us as a people, but we are a people. If you ask anyone live in Ireland, from where you are, he will say to you, I am Palestinian. If you ask him living in Australia, he will say, I am Palestinians. We have a strong and deep faith and conscience with our identity. That's the case. When I ask about, rights and rule of law, I am not asking to live with a settler in the same area here, for instance. I want the settlers to go back. And I want my people, also the refugees, to come back also to their land. That's the only way to make justice. And Palestinians, they make a compromise with themselves first when they accepted the two-state solution. We have no problem with the one state, one democratic state. We have no problem. We have no problem with the two-state solution. That's the case. The Palestinians, they have no problem. But the Israeli government policies, the extreme line, they don't want to see us staying in our country. Because of that, the situation here is different from South Africa. The Africans, they were not targeted. Their existence was not targeted. But here in Palestine, our existence is targeted. That's the case. And we will not disappear. And we have no other place to go to. Speaking to you in a very open way. But I do believe that, and I keep hope.
Well, that's good, Shawan. That's definitely what we need to hear. I want to ask you both about Biden's sort of hope or lack thereof of a Biden presidency. First of all, did the Trump presidency make a huge difference? I can imagine that moving the embassy to Jerusalem was significant. And is there hope that Biden, that he may do something to support the Palestinians? Or have you any hope there? Hagai first.
So first, on the Trump years, they've definitely been worse. But again, I think it's important for us to take the long-term perspective and again, understand that this did not begin with Trump. And if we go back to a president that was considered not only reasonable, but relatively very progressive, the Obama years ended up being 8 more years of settlement expansion, displacement and demolitions against Palestinians, and blanket impunity for Israel, right? That was the reality, not under Trump, under Obama. Trump was different in the sense that he tended more to say the silent part out loud and basically to spell out very openly that US foreign policy is openly backing the permanent Bantustanization of the West Bank. That's the meaning of the Trump plan, without permanent Israeli control, without giving Palestinian rights, apartheid with open American backing. Now with Biden, it's too early to call. I don't want to prejudge anything. These are early days in this new administration. There's been some encouraging steps. There have been many steps that have not been taken, and that's very disappointing. One example is not rescinding the Trump era executive order sanctions against the ICC. But regardless of the steps that have been taken to undo some of the Trump damage or not, this should not be just about going back to business as usual under Obama, because as I said, that was not enough at the time. What is needed is not just Trump. What is needed is a departure from Trump. What is needed is also a departure from Obama. What is needed is the introduction of consequences and actions by the US. And if not by the US, then by other international stakeholders. This should not be left just for US foreign policy.
But just you said that there was some signs that were encouraging. What was encouraging?
I think that there's there's a pause and there's a rethinking of the policy. Where that rethinking is going to arrive, I don't know. But again, it has to arrive at a different point to just going back to what has become known as business as usual. We need a departure from business as usual.
Shawan, I've got a message here from Kate, who's asking, for Irish people who are listening and shocked and who've never visited the territories, but obviously have a real interest in it. What can our Irish people do to push for change, to push the government for change? Maybe, recognizing Palestine, or tell us what you think Irish people could do, Shawan.
Look, you are not small. You are not small country or weak country. You are a rich country when it comes to values. This is a very important, you have to know. And you can make a change and you can make a difference and you can set a model. One of the model you can set to defend international law and to act according that. To push your government, for instance, to act according that. And to push also your parliament, for instance, to set, let me say, settlements or the occupied territory bill, for instance. When the bill at the first time passed at the parliament, the Palestinians here, they raised, the Irish flags on the roofs of municipality of Ramallah, Beit Lahem, and also at Al-Haq here, in front of me. You don't see it because the camera is not there. There is, the Irish flag there. That's an issue, for instance, you can demonstrate for. You can make a lot of things. One of that you have not to let, for instance, the settlements of products to get in your, I know that you have no that big amount of settlements of products, but by declaring that and acting according that and take specific steps, I think you send the message. You send the message and you set the model and the others, they will follow. I know that even, in Chile, they spoke to me and I translated the draft of your settlements bill, drafted to Spanish and send it to Chile. And other countries also, they are waiting for this. I think you can open the door in this one. Another thing you can push also for sanctions, to push also the EU to do. You are a member of the EU. At the Security Council, for instance, if the Israelis and the Americans come later on to act according a specific article in the ICC statute and to freeze, let me say, the investigation if it's open, and if they sit and form now the investigation team, you can also, you are a member of Security Council. You can advocate for that, not to let that happen, for instance, and to kill the way of justice. That's an issue you can deal with at the EU, UN, different places. You have to cooperate, for instance, with the ICC, and to defend the ICC, cooperate by providing also information and declare that information regarding what's going on here. You have embassy in Tel Aviv. You have here also representative office in Ramallah. You document also these things. It's good, for instance, to provide it. This is part of the duty and the obligation of the state parties of the ICC, according to the statute. Many, many things you can do for justice, and this is illegal steps. And for the people, I think you can push your government, your parliament, you can raise your voice strongly and speak about all of these things.
Hagai, I suppose you'd agree to all that. Is it down to the people to push their governments to act? And I suppose just in closing, what do you think would make Israel in turn react or listen to not only the people or the governments, but also people like yourselves and the report that you've had and your own assessment?
Yeah, in genuine democracies, there is a relationship between the policies that the government follows and where the public is and what the public demands from its elected officials, right? So I think that for people in Ireland and in other countries, they need to ask themselves, are they content with the way their government that represents them is expressing in its foreign policy, and again, not just in statements, but in actions, its rejection of this injustice and demanding that people demand from their governments to do more, to do much more that has been done so far, because honestly, what Palestinians and those that support justice in this place have received so far is nothing much more than just repeated statements, and those statements are part of what got us here, and that deep sense of impunity that Israel enjoys, and the ability of politicians to say, we can go on with this, everything is fine, we have no problem, there is no crisis, we can deal with the Palestinians, we continue demolitions and displacement, we continue expanding settlements, there is no problem. All that can change. And if anyone has any doubt with regard to, only the ability of countries as big as the US, for instance, to make a difference, then no, absolutely not. And I'll take just one key example, going back to the Security Council in 2016. After 8 years of Obama not allowing a Security Council resolution to move ahead, the reason that 2334 was adopted wasn't just because the Americans agreed not to veto it after 8 years, but because a faraway country, New Zealand, that was around a member of the council at the time, insisted on tabling that resolution and leading it, right? New Zealand did that. Only thanks to New Zealand's commitment to universal human rights, we got 2334. And after that, New Zealand paid a price in its bilateral relations with Israel, because that's the way Israel conducts its foreign policy. Ireland can make a difference. Ireland should make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. Great to meet you, Hagai. Shawan, if you're in the Al-Haq office there in Ramallah, I've been in that room back in 2015. I did the Al-Haq International Law course. It was fantastic. And if you're ever doing it again, or anyone watching is interested in it, it was amazing. And thanks a million also to Trócaire and Christian Aid. And I'm going to hand you back now to Caoimhe de Barra from Trócaire.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Shona. And first of all, on behalf of Trócaire and Christian Aid, I would like to thank Shawan and Hagai very much for their very powerful analysis and testimony this evening. We have heard a number of really strong and really clear and consistent messages from both of you. First of all, it's incredibly important to recognize that at the moment, there's no price to pay for continued human rights violations by Israel, and that this is enabling and allowing Israel to continue with the subjugation of the Palestinian people without any consequence. And Ireland, it's very clear that Ireland, with its role on the UN Security Council in particular, has a signal opportunity now to ensure accountability for the continued violations of international law. The very last thing that you said, Hagai, I think will remain with us. It's the power of a small country at the UN Security Council to make a difference. That passing of Resolution 2334 being achieved because New Zealand decided to take a stance. I think that's very important for all of us to hear, because sometimes we get the message that Ireland is an elected member of the Security Council. We don't have that kind of power. In fact, this shows us that if Ireland has the will to do it, yes, of course we have that power and can make a difference. I think what also really stood out was the recognition of the state of Palestine being incredibly important for two reasons. As Shawan said, it sends a message of hope to Palestinians, and to Israel, it sends a message that Palestinians are a people and have rights. And I think Hagai spoke about the fact that Shawan, that the Palestinian identity is being erased as human rights violations are being perpetrated. And this is an absolute violation of human rights. It's very interesting to hear both Hagai and Shawan talking about the longevity of these policies and being policies of the state of Israel, regardless of the political hue of whoever is in power at a particular moment. It's very important that we understand that the policies that have been designed over decades are designed to take more land from Palestinians, to demolish their homes, to demolish structures that have been funded and provided by the Irish government and Irish taxpayers. And it's not because of the source of funding that Palestinians have a right to protection. It's because they are human beings with implicit human rights. What we've also heard is that Israel's exploitation of natural resources in Palestinian land has been going on for years. And much of this has been the result of illegal settlement construction, which is a state policy. And this is why we believe, Trócaire, Christian Aid and our partners, that Ireland should pass the Occupied Territories Bill and ensure that we no longer engage effectively in sustaining the illegal settlements into the future. One thing which strikes me very strongly on reading the analysis around apartheid is something that Archbishop Desmond Tutu said. And he said that If you are neutral in the face of oppression, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. By making statements, but by not taking action, Ireland and other countries are effectively expressing a position of neutrality. And that needs to end, because by taking that position, Ireland is effectively on the side of the oppressor. And there really is no alternative way of looking at it when you listen to the analysis that we are getting from Hagai and Shawan. So we would encourage all of the attendees here today to keep in touch with Trócaire and Christian Aid to see how you can engage your elected representatives and take action to push for greater accountability and change in Israel and Palestine. Because as Shawan has said, there is hope for change. Change will happen. What our role is trying to make sure that that change happens sooner rather than later, to reduce the suffering that is evidently happening for so many Palestinians. So thank you all. Thank you, Shona, for your excellent hosting of this evening. Thank you, Hagai. Thank you, Shawan. Thank you to everyone who's been present with us this evening, and do stay in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you very much.